While 26 states have banned transgender medical treatments for minors so far, the ban in Tennessee has been challenged and is currently being reviewed by the United States Supreme Court. I'm Jennifer Rash reporting for TAB Media Group, and joining us today to discuss the concerns about these treatments is Brent Leatherwood, President of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. Brent, thank you for joining us.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Jennifer.
Okay, I know the topic's not technically a new topic, but it has resurfaced in the headlines because of the oral arguments before the Supreme Court on Wednesday, December the 4th. And you were there in the audience, so we wanted to just chat with you. We do want to talk about the concerns, but before we get there, back us into it with these oral arguments and what it was like being in the courtroom and what you saw and what you anticipate from the court.
Yeah, well, I'm still one of those people who every time I get to go to Washington, whether it's Congress, the White House, or the Supreme Court, I always just really appreciate the privilege that I have in this role to do those things. And yesterday was no different. To walk in to the Supreme Court and to see the justices and how they were working through the issues that are central to this case was just fascinating for somebody who has spent my career in policy and working around the edges of all kinds of legal issues and constitutional matters. I really appreciated what I was able to witness firsthand and in person, and then obviously, as a Tennessean, it was personally just fascinating being there and watching the justices debate with the respective counselors about this law that's here in Tennessee. But as you mentioned, is reflective of one that's been passed now by a majority of states.
Okay, so the law bans the treatment. So the treatments,
Sure.
tell us a little bit, explain that. What are some of the treatments? What is it like? And then what's the argument against that ban?
Yeah, so the ban, basically you just stated it. The ban prohibits transgender interventions and surgeries on minors in the state of Tennessee. That's pretty broadly what it does. Now, Tennessee does have, maybe some unique constructions that other states don't, which is why it has risen so quickly. This law actually just passed in 2023. So
Oh,
for it to get in front of the Supreme Court so quickly that's not usual. Typically it takes a few years for something to percolate all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. But that said, depending on how the justices render their decision, it could have wide applicability across the nation for all of these sorts of bans on this treatment. This stems from some investigations that were done on a clinic run here out of Nashville, out of Vanderbilt Medical Center, where lots of really good questions were raised about these sorts of radical experimental treatments that were being provided to children. And it runs the spectrum, everything from counseling and hormone therapy all the way to these surgeries. And Tennessee lawmakers took a look at it and said, this is not appropriate. These children are being harmed, and I think we need to be very clear about that. These may be children who are feeling some sort of discomfort between their physical bodies and how they sense themselves. I want to be very compassionate about that. But to think that you need to run to these sorts of extreme treatments for that strikes me, strikes any number of Southern Baptists, and struck our legislators here in Tennessee as just wildly inappropriate. And so they banned it. And that is what is being challenged before the Supreme Court.
So just the concept of not allowing minors is what's being challenged. But now adults could choose to do this, correct?
Yeah, adults could. The law thus far is silent on that. I think most Southern Baptists, we could articulate a perspective that says that that also is inappropriate. But the question before the court, this law centers only on minors. And your first question, to go back to your previous question, you asked, what's the argument against it? Well, the argument against it would be that these are minors, and so these are actually parents who are making the determination that they need this type of medical care. And look, we want to be very respectful, obviously, of parental rights, and we do think that minors they're not able to make these sorts of life-altering decisions, and so we typically will defer to parents. But in this instance, the decisions by parents are actually leading to harm for their children. And a lot of folks want to just focus in on this issue. But when we look at something like abortion, we wouldn't say that that's appropriate, where parents want to take the life of their preborn child. So no, we've already got a category that we operate in. Particularly as Southern Baptists and evangelicals and Christians, where we know that there are some lines that should not be crossed when it comes to the health of children, and we're just applying that here, and that's essentially what we said in our brief, one that we did alongside our friends at the Tennessee Baptist Convention, that we put in front of the justices to say that this is an entirely appropriate law. And not only is it appropriate, it is constitutional, and that's really where the conflict is before the court, because the Biden administration and the ACLU, which are on the other side, they say that this is a violation of the equal protection rights of these children, and so that's really what was being argued in front of the Supreme Court yesterday.
Speak more to how it is constitutional. How would you differ from the side that's saying it's unconstitutional? How is it constitutional?
Sure. Well, I reject the premise that it's a violation of equal protection, because it's actually equally protecting both boys and girls who are minors.
Okay.
The Solicitor General for Tennessee, a gentleman by the name of Matthew Rice, he was actually articulating the perspective of the state of Tennessee in this case, and he did a great job. It was actually his first time before the U.S. Supreme Court, and just as an aside, goodness, what a pressure-packed moment.
I can only imagine.
The folks who do that for a living, it's a sight to behold, especially in person. But anyways, General Rice, he was helping the justices, I think, to understand that this isn't about some sort of regulation based on the gender of the child. That's actually not the case at all. Instead, it's a regulation about the use of the specific medicines that are, a part of all of this, transgender therapy. And so what Tennessee is saying is that the way that these particular medications and these medical interventions are used, it is that which the state of Tennessee is seeking to prohibit. And at one point, he gave, it was towards the end of his presentation, but he gave what I thought was a really helpful analogy, not just for the justices, but for all of us watching. He talked about morphine. Morphine is something that, if it's used in one context, let's say by someone to assist in a suicide of an individual, well, we would say that that's wrong. But if morphine is used because somebody's in a lot of pain, right after a surgery or something, well, then we say, no, that's permissible. And so he is saying that Tennessee is viewing these medicines and the way that they're used as what is being regulated. So it's a medical use regulation, not a regulation based on sex. And that's what the U.S. Solicitor General, as well as the attorney from the ACLU, kept really trying to press. And I actually think that General Rice did a very good job rebutting that line of argument.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense how they're putting that out there for sure. So now the justices have to decide. So they've got all the information. Um, the research, the little bit of research I've done, not much, but the little bit I'm finding that other countries are that maybe were ahead of us on this
Right.
are pulling back. We may be a little behind, and so we're chasing a little bit, but they're coming back now. Um, Number one, am I accurate on that? I think that's what I've discovered.
Mhm.
And
Yes.
then two, I'm I'm hearing they're anecdotal, so I don't have a lot of facts based on this, but anecdotally, I'm hearing attorneys are being hired by people who decided to go through with a treatment and then something changed.
Right. They
And
change their
so,
mind and they're
yeah,
detransitioning. Yes.
and so they're suing the I'm not sure who, but they're suing because they didn't understand enough or they didn't have enough information or something. So talk to me about that. Like I said, I'm very
Oh,
low
sure.
level in my research on this, but talk to me about all of those pieces.
Well, so that last part, that's a line of litigation that's a little bit separate than this case, but
Mhm.
the population of detransitioners is actually somewhat an interesting facet for this case.
Mhm.
Um, as a matter of fact, as I was waiting to go into the court yesterday, I got to meet an individual who was at the center of bringing together a whole community of folks who have detransitioned, and they came together and filed a brief supporting the state of Tennessee. So just like we did at the ERLC alongside the Tennessee Baptist Convention,
Mhm.
a community of detransitioners came and said that they are supporting the Tennessee law, and so that was pretty interesting, and that group in particular came up at one point during well, actually at several points during the oral arguments yesterday, because the court was trying to determine exactly how far the U.S. government under the Biden administration wanted to press their case. In other words, should folks who identify or say that they're transgender, are they trying to say that they should be a protected class? Well, traditionally, a protected class is based on characteristics that are what's called immutable in the law. So think, for example, your skin color. You can't change your skin color.
Mhm.
And so the law recognizes that there might be specific classes of people, and they were really probing the line of argument by the U.S. Solicitor General as to whether she was basically advocating for that. And she
Okay.
stopped a little short of it, and said they weren't necessarily trying to make that argument, but that it could get there. And then Justice Alito had what I thought was a very insightful line of inquiry, where he talked about transgenderism, and the very nature of it means that you can change if you accept what those
Okay.
attorneys were saying, that you can change. And he said, by definition, that's not immutable, that's changing.
That's
And then
interesting.
he floated out there, well, don't you acknowledge that there are certain people that consider themselves gender fluid, which means they're in a constant state of change? And so he was basically pointing out the absurdity of, how could you say that this is an immutable class? It's constantly in flux. So in that sense, that's when that came up, and I really think it undermined a major portion of their arguments yesterday. And and then, to your question about some European countries that have actually come back from the positions that they've stated previously. One of those is the United Kingdom. They've actually closed down their clinic, known as Tavistock, because they found that it actually wasn't helping individuals, and so they closed it down. And the justices were talking about some of these instances, and really saying that for them, as U.S. Supreme Court justices, none of them having a medical background, was it really appropriate for them to come and weigh in against what the state of Tennessee is doing.
Mm.
And to that point, the Tennessee Solicitor General said, we obviously don't think so. And you yourselves in the Dobbs decision have talked about the wisdom of states pursuing their own policies. And if you just apply that thinking to this question, you arrive at a place where 26 different states have now said this is inappropriate for children within our jurisdictions. And I honestly, I think that number is likely to grow.
And what you're saying about the states aspect, it seems like there may be a shift now toward or back toward states making some of the decisions and calls on that. Um, so that would be interesting to watch to see if that becomes part of the argument in and of itself, even.
Well, yes, I think that's true, and then at the same time, we shouldn't dismiss the fact that the federal government also has a role to play here.
Mhm.
The over well in the calendar year 2023, the ERLC, we filed comments about 18 different rules changes and executive actions that were taken by the Biden administration, and any number of them were actually on this issue,
Wow.
basically trying to push a transgender ideology throughout all different parts of government. And one of the things that I am hopeful about with a changeover in administration back to the Trump administration is the real opportunity to pull back on those things and root them out because those changes are, I mean, they're unacceptable. And I think it's not really reflective of where the country is. And so, yes, states, I think, are going to pursue their own policies here. I think a majority of them, a majority of them already have spoken and said that we don't think this is appropriate. I think more of them are likely to do so. And I think that the Supreme Court, after yesterday's oral arguments, are at a minimum likely to uphold what Tennessee has done here. My hope is that they actually say that nationwide it's appropriate for states to take this kind of action.
Mm. That makes sense. What about, I guess when you were talking, I was thinking about the speed to which all of this seems to have happened. And maybe
Right.
it's not as fast as it seems, but there seems to be this urgent need to go to the medical treatment for the individual, or the urgent need for the parent to take care of that for the child, or the urgent need for this law, like you said, it moved through quickly to the Supreme Court. What's the urgency behind all of this?
Well, I think the urgency in terms of Tennessee passing the law is because the real harm that is being done to children. I
Mhm,
mean, this does. I mean, obviously, it physically alters their bodies
mhm,
for the rest of their lives,
mhm,
and it does deep, lasting psychological damage and emotional damage to these children as well. So that's the rush to prohibit it.
mhm,
I think the rush to challenge it is because so many of these progressive organizations have just really bought deeply in to
mhm,
this notion of transgender ideology, and so that's probably part of the reason that this case made it so quickly up to the U.S. Supreme Court.
mhm,
But just like in those instances that you pointed out over in Europe, some of those countries are really starting to rethink this harm and whether it's worth it. And for Christians, right, we stand in support of laws that protect children and reflect God's good design. And so there's a real urgency on our part to speak out against these laws and to say that or excuse me, to speak out against these practices and
right.
support these laws that prohibit them. This Tennessee law, in fact, is one that we supported in our very first state policy agenda that we created. That we were trying to pick out various proposals across the country at the state legislative level, and we create the state public policy agenda in conjunction with our state conventions
Mhm.
to highlight a few that are coming up in various legislative sessions. And this law was one of the ones that we supported. So personally, organizationally, we're actually invested in this law and making sure that it stays on the books. And again, after yesterday's oral argument, I really do think that a majority of the justices will vote to uphold what Tennessee has done here as appropriate, that it is not a violation of equal protection, and that it's about helping children who are vulnerable.
Mm. And I think about the children who are in the middle right now who may get caught in this gap, and then, what does that do to their future, and what does that look like? That little, um, yeah, it's a little scary to think about that to some ways.
But that was, that was one of the things that struck me after the oral arguments, and I was kind of reviewing some of my notes. The fact that so much of the conversation happened yesterday with the U.S. Solicitor General and the ACLU, and there was a lot of discussion about vulnerable children,
Mhm.
but there was no recognition that it is these hormone therapies, these medical interventions, these just radical surgeries that are in fact the very things that are rendering these children vulnerable.
Mm.
And you don't have to be in kids ministry too long to see that kids act in all sorts of different ways, and as they're growing up and figuring out who they are and what God is calling them to be,
Mm.
and to think that there are some folks who take that, and instead of patiently walking alongside a child, instead see that they need to run to these sorts of options. I'm sorry. I think it is entirely appropriate for the government, which has a God ordained authority to promote good and to constrain evil, as we talk about both when we discuss Scripture and Baptist faith and message. Um, it's entirely appropriate for the state to step in and foreclose these options because it does truly harm children.
Another side of that too could be what the church could do. So just curious, I know policy is your area, but just curious, the children who are struggling, who need someone to walk with them, are our churches more scared of that situation than helpful, possibly? And if so, what are some ways we could improve on, and how we could be part of the change, the positive influence in this, and to help with? I mean, I can only imagine if you're the parent, there's fear, there's
Mm.
confusion, um, there's a sense of wanting to help your child and protect. There's there's a lot of things that maybe you don't know what to do with, and if the church is not there because the church doesn't want to deal with this topic, um, maybe they go to what just the only answer they know. So, I don't know, unpack that for me a little bit.
Well, you're right that obviously with my background, I have an affinity towards the policy side of our mandate, but we actually have a dual mandate. Not only are we called to go into the public square at the ERLC, pushed forward by our churches in doing that, but we also have the responsibility to equip our churches. And so one thing I would encourage pastors, and so many of them are doing this right, but don't be afraid to proclaim God's good design and help people understand the goodness of Genesis 1:26 and 1:27, the fact that we are made in His image, and the responsibilities that are attached to that. And look, it's not just helping encourage those pastors and exhorting them to preach about it from the pulpit, but also we've produced real resources. We actually have a resource that we came out with last year. It's a booklet called God's Good Design, And I'm proud to say that, I mean, gosh, thousands of churches, pastors reached out and asked for that and downloaded it. And in fact, we had such a good response to it. We had to come up with a drop shipping option on our website that folks could order it directly from the website, because we had a number of pastors say, "Hey, I'm actually going to preach through this in my Sunday night sermon series or my Wednesday night series, or I'm going to provide this to all of the small groups in my church." And so, folks can find that at ERLC.com, and basically it's a gender and sexuality guide. So it not only walks through theological principles, but on the back end of it, it has real practical scenarios from folks that we have talked to at various churches, and how they worked through situations in a way that we think is both consistent with Scripture, but also wise. And so I would point your audience to that. It's free. It's a free resource, and I would encourage folks to avail themselves of that, because the team did a really good job putting that one together.
Good deal. Good deal. Well, back to policy before I let you go.
Sure.
As believers, living life, doing our thing, trying to understand the legislature and our states and all that's going on, what are some ways that we as individual citizens, Christians in our states, how can we be most helpful regarding laws such as this one going forward?
Yeah. Well, there are, as we mentioned at the top, there are 26 states. So that means a majority of states right now have passed policies either limiting or prohibiting these sorts of radical experimental procedures and therapies for children. That's a good thing. That said, that means it's a little less than half the country that hasn't taken steps there. Now, I am optimistic that number will grow,
Mhm.
but it will only grow if citizens articulate that they want it to their leaders.
Mhm.
So I would say, as fellow Baptists, as Christians, don't be afraid to let lawmakers know that this is something that you're prioritizing, because it does harm children, and we should be a voice for the vulnerable. And I think this is an entirely appropriate way to do that. And this is all happening at the state level. This isn't happening in Congress. Congress, it takes so long for things to work through the system, and that's okay. That's actually the way the founders meant for it to happen. But often at the state level, things move quite a bit quicker. And those legislators, they actually do want to hear from you. So look up who is your member of the House or member of the Senate. If you're in Nebraska, you only have one legislative chamber, but so with that caveat, but don't be afraid to reach out to them, because they do need that sort of feedback, and just wisely and calmly make a case for why you think this is an appropriate step for your state to take. And at the same time, for those of us who might live in those 26 states that have already taken action here, don't be afraid to tell them thank you for doing this. And then I would say, look, we're a praying people, right? Let's pray for the wisdom for the nine justices,
Mhm.
to make sure that they come back with a ruling that upholds this Tennessee law as appropriate and constitutional, and so that it serves as a model for other legislative bodies. And so I hope it's not a contentious debate. I want a unanimous decision. We're probably not likely to get that, but we should be praying towards that end, and for clarity on this issue. And then, in the meantime, between now and when the justices render their decision, let's be praying for these children at the center of this issue, and these families that, in many ways, a lot of these families, they're just looking for help and support. And instead of allowing them to go to these radical physicians and other, let's welcome them to the church and say, hey, we can walk alongside you and help you through this season. And because I think for many of them, they just need ministry, and that's really what we're really good at in the SBC.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This is very helpful,
Yeah,
and it'll be interesting to watch what happens.
right.
So
Well,
the
I
ruling
appreciate the
should come out.
opportunity.
Yeah, the ruling should come out in next year, probably.
This probably will be a highly watched case, and generally the Supreme Court saves those till the end of their term. So probably the latter half of June, maybe about the time that we're all getting together in Dallas, the SBC annual meeting is when we can expect it, or shortly thereafter. That's usually when their higher profile cases come out. So that's my expectation. If it comes out sooner, great, prayers answered. But I wouldn't bet on that expectation. And I'm Baptist, so I don't do that.
Sounds great. Well, thank you, Brett.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate you.